You know, or hopefully know, the basics for introducing characters. Make their name all caps when we first meet them, describe, or better yet, have the character do a specific thing that encapsulates their character. Don't over-describe, but use that as a tool if it helps you. And the more space you take on the page for the actual description and introduction of a character, the more important that character seems to the story. And we can also throw in that if you give a first and last name, the character feels much more important than if you just call them Frank or Mary or especially Bald Mercenary. But those are the mechanics. Part of screenwriting is also an art, and it's a craft. And there are 3 things that you need to keep in mind when it comes to introducing the antagonists in our stories. Those lovely, delicious morsels we like to call villains. Before I jump into the 3 things, a quick caveat. These 3 things I'm going to give you are options you have at your disposal. Tools in your toolbox. And you can use all 3 if you want, but you don't have to. More than likely, you should at least be using the last one that I'm going to mention. But even then, it may not be totally appropriate for the way you're trying to tell your story. So the best version of the storytelling always wins. And that's what we're really talking about here. Is storytelling. In any script you read, you can take out the character introductions and the story will still make sense. You aren't missing any story beats or character beats or anything. Character introductions are completely useless when it comes to the story, but when it comes to the storytelling, character descriptions are potential gold if you use them effectively. And honestly, where a lot of new writers mess up is they think the character introductions are a story beat or a plot point. Nope, they are solely for the reader. Because again, you're writing a script to be read, not shot, and you want the experience for the reader to be awesome and fantastic. So here we go. One tool you can use when introducing a villain is to hear about them before we meet them. And this is sometimes used for protagonists, but it's most often reserved for the villain. And often, it's by other villainous characters, some other bad henchmen, people like that. And they're talking about how to behave when the new guy meets the boss. So you got the henchman, there's the new guy, and it's like, hey, don't do this, and make sure you do this, or else, all right? It's that kind of a thing. And what this does is it creates expectations for the reader. Expectations that you, the storyteller, can now break. The trick is, though, that however one character talks about the villain, so our first impression of how we think the villain is, that we think the villain is one way, but when we meet the villain, our actual impression should be much worse or maybe much softer than what was set up. I mean, we hear about Hannibal Lecter long before we meet him, and Clarice has to go through several security checks before she actually meets him. And he is not what we expect. He's clean cut, he's put together, he speaks formally, but we get a clear sense that he is lethal underneath everything and smart. Very, very smart, which makes villains seem scarier. Clowns are scary. Dolls are scarier. Monsters can be scary, but we know they aren't real. Dolls are real. But smart psychopaths, okay, they'll keep you up at night. So the first trick is hearing about the villain before meeting them. And the reason this is effective is because of the payoff. The villain must be different than the expectations you set up. Now, this is a great storytelling boon for you because now the reader trusts you. You promised we'd meet the villain, and we met the villain, but the character is different than we expected. So now the reader knows you are going to be able to keep them on their toes and not have a predictable story. The second trick for introducing a villain, keep them silent for as long as possible. We can meet them, they're in the room, they're right there, but they're polishing their glasses or decanting some wine or hitting golf balls, but they aren't talking. You know how it is when you walk into a room and the person there with the most power doesn't say anything, and you're like, what am I supposed to say? And if you're like, nope, I've never really experienced that, then maybe reflect on your childhood. I remember as a teenager being late for my curfew, expecting my dad to be very angry, and he didn't say a word, not one. And it was unnerving to say the least. Not that my dad is a villain, he's not, he's awesome and I am very blessed, but in that moment, he was the scariest thing ever. So the scarier you want your villain to be, One tool is to hold out on them speaking for a bit. Darth Vader doesn't say much, he chooses his words. The Godfather chooses his words. But when characters start talking right off the bat about how they're going to destroy someone else for getting in their way, they just come off as cartoonish and too over the top. Not scary, not a formidable villain. And this is a really important point. The villains in your story should be able to defeat your protagonist. On paper, they are stronger, smarter, better, faster, everything the hero is not. And it's only through the hero's ingenuity that they can overcome the villain. So make sure your villain is strong enough to defeat the protagonist, or a solid introduction isn't even going to help you. And I alluded to this earlier, but one way to help with this is to give the villain something to do in the scene that is unrelated to the topic of the scene and why the other characters are there. So they're all there, but the villain is doing something else. They have business, they're active in the scene. And by giving them something to do, you are inherently giving them an excuse to not have to talk. Now the cliche is the villain's in a strip club or in the middle of some sex or drug-induced orgy or sitting in a crowded bar and drinking like a fish, okay? That's the cliche. Smarter examples are when they're at batting practice or field dressing a deer they just shot, or even watering houseplants or sorting laundry. Now be creative, because there's not much more that would unsettle a reader than to have an alleged assassin who enjoys using kitchen cutlery to fillet his victims, than to put him in the kitchen making a salad and slicing tomatoes with precision cutting skills. And the last trick to help you introduce a villain, even if you aren't using the previous two tools that I gave you for your toolbox, you should be cognizant of this one. Introductions are about feelings, not what we see. Remember, character introductions are storytelling, not story. Storytelling is all about making the reader feel something about the characters and the story being told. You're taking them on a ride, so give them a ride. And when you introduce a character, especially a villain, you want the reader to feel a very specific way about them. Maybe you want the reader to know that the character is a villain the first time we meet them. In the introduction, then you're going to want to be sure you're using words where everyone knows, hey, this is the villain. But maybe you don't want the reader to know yet. Maybe that's a big reveal later in your story. But for now, you want the reader to really be on the side of the villain, so that later it's a surprise when we find out that they are, in fact, the true villain. Again, we're playing with expectations here, but this is a long-term strategy as opposed to a shorter strategy that we already talked about. But the trick is you want to be using language that evokes emotion in a character introduction. And this is why over-describing is bad. The reader doesn't really care what the character looks like. Not really. The reader cares about how they are supposed to feel about that character. Am I supposed to like this character or not? Am I supposed to remember this character or not? Are they important to the story or not? Am I supposed to agree with this character or not? Am I or the other characters supposed to be scared of this character or not? Remember, storytelling is about two emotions primarily, hope and fear. And we should be feeling one way or the other about the villain as soon as we meet them. And you can and should totally mess with our expectations about them when we meet them, because we think they're one way only to learn that there's something completely different. So give us an emotional ride. Help us understand how to feel about the villain. But villains are only one type of character in any story you tell, and technically they're a supporting character. And if you want to know more about the types of characters in your story, you should watch this. If you found value, fun buttons, if you want to go to the next level in your screenwriting, Screenplay Navigator, links below, and when you tell a story that matters. See you later.